I was finishing the last names on my guest list at 11:51 p.m. when the text from my mother came through. The screen of my phone flickered in the dark of my office, a tiny beacon of what I thought was a family milestone. Instead, it was a locked door. My mother wrote, "Your sister's wedding is the family's priority. We can't make it to yours." No! Exclamation mark. No, I'm so sorry. Just a cold, grammatical finality that landed like a lead weight. Seconds later, I watched a small heart icon appear next to the message. My sister, Sienna, had hearted it. She wasn't just aware of the betrayal. She was celebrating it. In that moment, the air in the room changed. It became thin, clinical, and quiet. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Like you were just a supporting character in someone else's highlight reel? Let me know your story down in the comments and tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know who else has had to find their own way out of the shadows. I didn't reach for a tissue. I didn't type out a long, emotional paragraph begging them to change their minds. I didn't even call to ask why. I just stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop, typed 2 words, "That's fine," and hit send. Then, I closed the laptop with a soft, decisive click. That sound was the final beat of a 28-year song I was no longer interested in singing. By 11:55 p.m., my shock had already transformed into a list of strategic exits. I opened my wedding portal and began the process of what I call the Great Audit. For years, I had been the reasonable one. I was the logistics expert, the chief executive officer who optimized global supply chains during the day and family drama at night. I had spent my entire life being flexible so that my parents and Sienna could stay rigid. I was the one who moved my dates, changed my hair, and lowered my voice so they wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable. I looked at the contracts for the Chicago ballroom I had reserved for my wedding. I had secretly paid the full $50,000 deposit, not just for my ceremony, but for the family celebration package that included a suite for my parents and a VIP dressing room for Sienna. They thought the venue had given them a loyalty discount. In reality, it was just me, footing the bill for my own marginalization. I began clicking cancel. I removed the floral upgrades for the parents' table. I revoked the premium open bar I had added because I knew my father liked top-shelf bourbon. I cut the extra night at the hotel for Sienna's bridesmaids. Every click felt like a debt being settled. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, and they had just defaulted on the loan. It's funny how clearly you see things once you stop trying to color within the lines people draw for you. My loyalty had a sunk cost, and for the first time in my life, I was willing to take the loss and walk away from the table. By 12:03 a.m., the Chicago wedding was gone. I sat there in the silence of my apartment, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. I wasn't a bride-to-be in crisis. I was an architect with a blank plot of land. I wasn't going to fight for a seat at their table anymore. I was going to build my own, and this time, the guest list would be earned, not assigned. When I think back to our house in Chicago, I don't remember the smells of home cooking or the sound of shared laughter. I remember the silence of being edited out. There's a photo album in my parents' living room that tells the story better than any therapist could. It's filled with page after page of Sienna. Sienna in pink tutus, Sienna holding dance trophies, Sienna blowing out candles while the world watched in awe. I appear in those photos maybe 3 times in 20 years, usually cropped at the very edge or with my back turned. When I was 16, I found an original print from a family vacation. I remembered standing right beside Sienna, our shoulders touching. But in the version my mother had framed on the wall, my face was gone. She had literally trimmed the photo to make the composition neater. That's when I learned that, in our family, space was a luxury, and I was expected to live in the margins. They called me lucky because things came easier to me. That word always felt like a slap. It didn't come easy. I worked 18-hour days to build my logistics firm, while Sienna spent her 20s finding her brand on our parents' dime. But being the strong one is a trap. If you don't complain, they assume you don't feel. If you solve every problem, they assume you have none. I became the family's invisible foundation. 3 years ago, When the bank sent a foreclosure notice on my parents' house because my father's investments fell through, I didn't say a word. I just wired $45,000 to cover the back taxes and the mortgage arrears. I told them it was a government grant I'd help them apply for. I didn't want them to feel the weight of the debt. I just wanted them to be safe. I was the silent investor in a business that never planned on paying me a dividend. I realized that night, looking at my canceled Chicago contracts, that my parents weren't just choosing Sienna's wedding. They were choosing the only child who still made them feel needed by being a constant catastrophe. My stability was boring to them. My success was just a utility. I remembered my grandmother Eleanor used to whisper to me during those long family dinners where no one asked about my grades or my business. She'd lean in and say, "Maya, some people only see what's shiny, but the stone is what holds the house up. Don't you ever let them make you feel small for being the floor they stand on." I had spent $45,000 to keep a roof over their heads, and they couldn't spend a 5-hour flight to stand by my side. It wasn't just about a wedding date anymore. It was about the realization that my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for decades. I didn't feel sadness as I sat there in the dark. I felt the kind of clarity that only comes when the fog finally lifts and you see the cliff's edge. I wasn't going to be the adjustable one anymore. I opened a private folder on my desktop titled Tuscany. It contained the deed to a $7.2 million estate in the Val d'Orcia, a castle of honey-colored stone and silver olive groves that I'd bought as a corporate retreat 3 years ago. My family didn't even know I owned it. They thought I still lived in a rented 2-bedroom. The foundation was moving, and I was taking the house with me. The next morning, the silence of my apartment was broken by the sound of my mother's ringtone. It was that frantic, high-pitched trill she only used when something had disrupted the family harmony, which usually meant Sienna was upset. I didn't answer. I watched the phone vibrate against the marble counter, feeling a strange, detached curiosity. 3 minutes later, a voicemail notification popped up. I hit play. My mother's voice didn't start with a greeting. It started with an accusation. "Maya, I just got a call from the Palmer house. They said the deposits for the ballroom and the suite blocks were withdrawn. Sienna is hysterical. She thinks there's been a banking error on your end. You need to call them and fix this immediately. We have vendors expecting those payments by noon." I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee. The numbers didn't lie. I had simply stopped balancing their books. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Sienna. "Maya, what is going on? Mom says the venue is canceled. This is my wedding month. You know I'm under so much stress with the branding launch. Stop being dramatic and pay the invoice. I'll Venmo you my half when the sponsors pay out." The audacity would have made me laugh if it weren't so clinical. Sienna's half was a myth she'd been selling for years, and my parents were her primary buyers. I realized in that moment that they didn't want a daughter. They wanted a treasurer. They didn't even ask if I was okay after they'd bailed on my wedding. They only cared that the fountain of money had suddenly run dry. I finally called my mother back. Her voice was sharp. "Maya, thank God. Did you fix it?" "There's nothing to fix." "Mom," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "Since you and Dad can't make it to my wedding, there's no reason for me to maintain a venue in Chicago. I've moved my ceremony." "Moved it," she stammered. "But Sienna needs that ballroom." The florist already mapped out her gold tier walls for that space. We were counting on the logistical overlap to save money. "You're being incredibly selfish, Maya. You've always been the independent one, the one who doesn't need the spotlight. Can't you just be flexible for once?" "Flexible," I repeated. The word felt like old, rusted wire. "I've been flexible for 28 years, Mom. I've bent until I was nearly invisible so that Sienna could have the center of the room. But I'm done being the floor you all stand on." "It's just logistics, Maya," she yelled. "Logistics. You of all people should understand that." "You're right," I replied. "It is logistics. And the math no longer adds up. I'm not paying for a wedding I'm not attending, and I'm certainly not subsidizing a family that considers me a second-tier priority. Tell Sienna to find a new sponsor. I'm out of the branding business." I hung up before she could respond. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. For the first time, the reasonable one was doing the most reasonable thing possible, protecting her own borders. I walked to my bedroom and packed a single suitcase. Chicago was cold, gray, and filled with people who only saw me as a utility. I had a flight to catch. I wasn't going to a wedding anymore. I was going home to a castle they didn't even know existed. The air in the Val d'Orscia was different from Chicago, softer, smelling of crushed rosemary and ancient stone. When the gates of the Castello di Maia creaked open, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest. This $7.2 million estate wasn't just a property. It was proof that I had built a life they couldn't even imagine. The golden light hit the honey-colored walls of the villa, and for the first time in weeks, I breathed. I spent the next few days in a state of quiet, professional focus. I wasn't just a bride. I was the chief executive officer of my own piece. I hired local craftsmen, men like Signor Rossi, whose hands were stained with the dust of the valley, and Lucia, a chef who treated every ingredient like a sacred gift. They didn't see me as an adjustable child or a silent investor. To them, I was the signora of the estate, a woman of vision and substance. This was what I call the heritage of choice. We're taught that blood is the only thing that binds us, but that's a lie designed to keep people in toxic orbits. True family is built through presence, not just DNA. As I sat on the terrace sketching the layout for the long stone table, I realized I was finally building something that didn't require me to shrink. I began sending out the new invitations. No embossed gold or corporate Chicago addresses, just simple cream cards with a single olive leaf pressed inside. I called my cousin Jordan first. Maya? Jordan's voice was cautious. I heard about the blowout in Chicago. Your mom is telling everyone you've had a mental breakdown and fled the country. I haven't fled, Jordan, I said, watching the sunset turn the hills a deep violet. I've just relocated. I'm in Tuscany, at my estate. I want you here. I've already booked your flight. There was a long silence. Your estate? Maya, what are you talking about? The life I built while everyone was looking at Siena, I replied. Are you in? I'm in, he said, his voice cracking. I'm so tired of pretending the Chicago house isn't a theater. I'll be there. Then came the call to Grandma Eleanor. She didn't even wait for me to explain. I've already got my bags packed, sweetheart, she whispered. I was just waiting for you to realize that you were too big for that little room they kept you in. I don't care if I have to swim across the ocean. I'm going to see you stand tall. One by one, the omitted ones began to RSVP. The aunts who were always sat in the back row. The cousins who were never shiny enough for Siena's Instagram feed. They weren't coming for a show. They were coming for me. Back in Chicago, the group chat was a war zone. I could see the notifications piling up my mother's rage. Siena's frantic demands for money. My father's practical advice to just apologize and come home. I didn't open a single one. I was busy standing in the olive grove, feeling the wind move through the trees. My silence wasn't a lack of communication. It was a boundary. I was no longer an employee in their family business. I was the architect of my own world, and for the first time, the logistics of peace were perfectly balanced. 2 days before the ceremony, Grandma Eleanor arrived at the Castello. She didn't look like a woman who had just survived a 10-hour flight. She looked like a general arriving at the front lines. She didn't head for the guest suite. Instead, she asked for a glass of red wine and sat me down at the massive oak table in the great hall. She pulled a thick, manila legal file from her carry-on and slid it across the wood toward me. Maya, she said, her voice unusually grave. I've spent my life watching your father and mother treat the family legacy like a personal piggy bank. But this is where the line is drawn in the dirt. I opened the file. My stomach dropped as I scanned the documents. It was a series of wire transfer requests and an application for a high-interest bridge loan. My father, Robert, had attempted to liquidate the family trust, the one set aside for the grandchildren's education and long-term care to cover the gold-tier costs of Siena's Chicago wedding. But that wasn't the worst part. To get the bank to release the funds, he had attempted to forge Eleanor's signature as the primary trustee. The betrayal moved from emotional neglect to criminal desperation. I looked at the signature on the third page. It was a clumsy imitation of Eleanor's elegant script, a desperate scrawl made by a man who had run out of other people's money to spend. He thought I wouldn't notice, Eleanor whispered, her eyes flashing with a cold, righteous fire. He thought I was just an old woman in the corner of the room. He was so focused on making sure Sienna had her perfect day that he was willing to steal the future of everyone else in this family to pay for it. I leaned back, the paper crinkling in my hand. This was the lethal discovery. This wasn't just favoritism. It was fraud. My father wasn't just choosing a favorite daughter. He was a predator in a suit, willing to consume the foundation of the house just to keep the lights on for one last party. "What do you want to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Eleanor reached out and covered my hand with hers. "I've already notified the bank and the estate lawyers. The trust is frozen. Your father is currently under internal review, but Maya, you have the final piece of the puzzle. You've been the one quietly fixing their messes for years. If you step in now and pay the vendors, the investigation might go away. If you don't, the house of cards falls." I looked out the window at the olive groves. For a split second, the old Maya, the reasonable one, wanted to reach for her checkbook. I wanted to fix it, to protect my father from the consequences of his own ego, to keep the family name out of the mud. But then I remembered the text at 11:51 p.m. I remembered the heart emoji from Sienna. I remembered the $45,000 I'd paid in back taxes that they'd treated like a government grant. This wasn't a family crisis. It was a crime scene. And I was done being the person who cleaned up the mess. "I'm not doing a thing, Grandma," I said. And for the first time, I felt the weight of my own power. "I'm not the family's insurance policy anymore. If he forged your name, he can explain it to the board. I have a wedding to host." I closed the file and stood up. The silent investor had officially divested. My father had spent years betting on my silence and my bottomless capacity for forgiveness. He'd finally made a bet he couldn't cover. As I walked Eleanor to her room, the air felt lighter. The lethal truth was out, and the only person who could have saved them had finally decided to save herself instead. The morning of the weddings arrived under the same sun, but in two entirely different worlds. In Chicago, the air was heavy, humid, and thick with the scent of impending disaster. I knew what was happening because Jordan was sending me silent updates from the hotel ballroom. Sienna was in a state of total collapse. The gold-tier florist had pulled the flower walls at 6 a.m. because my father's wire transfer had bounced. The branding sponsors she'd bragged about had vanished the moment they realized the logistics CEO sister was no longer associated with the event. The photos Jordan sent showed a hollow room. Half the chairs were empty. My mother was standing by the entrance in a lavender dress that looked brittle, smiling a wide, desperate smile at guests who were whispering behind their hands. They were looking for Grandma Eleanor. They were looking for the aunts and the cousins. They were looking for me. Meanwhile, in the Val d'Orcia, the light was turning the hills of Tuscany into a living painting. There was no choreography, no branding, and no desperation. There was just a long stone table set beneath a canopy of vines, lined with candles and wildflowers I'd picked myself. I stood in the great hall, looking at my reflection. I wasn't wearing a grand, glittering gown designed to outshine anyone. I was wearing simple, soft silk that caught the afternoon light. Lucia, my chef and friend, pinned a sprig of olive leaves into my hair and whispered, "For truth." "Signora." When I stepped outside, the omitted ones rose as one. There was no orchestra, just the rustle of the wind and the sound of people who had actually chosen to be there. I walked down the aisle toward my husband, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was taking up too much space. I felt like the space was finally big enough for me. The ceremony was a semantic shift. I realized that for years, my family had used the word logistics as a synonym for servitude. To them, it meant I was the one who handled the labor so they could handle the glory. But as I said my vows, I reclaimed the word. Logistics is about precision. It's about integrity. It's about making sure the things that matter get to where they need to be. And I had finally moved my heart to the right place. As the sun dipped behind the hills, turning the sky a deep, bruised gold, the photos from Tuscany hit the family group chat. Jordan told me later that the Chicago ballroom went silent. One of the bridesmaids had gasped while scrolling through her phone, and within minutes, the image of me and Grandma Eleanor laughing under the Tuscan lanterns was being passed around like a secret. The visual truth was lethal. My parents weren't just embarrassed. They were exposed. They had told everyone I was having a breakdown, but the photos showed a woman who was more composed and powerful than she had ever been in their house. Halfway through the dinner, my phone buzzed on the stone ledge, a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was shaking, high and thin with a rage that was actually just terror. "Maya, how could you do this?" "Everyone is talking. Your father is. There are people here asking questions about the trust. You made us look like fools. You've always been so cold. But this is cruelty." I listened to it while sipping a glass of wine made from the grapes in my own vineyard. The venom in her tone didn't penetrate the stone walls of my castle. I hit delete. I looked over at the table. Grandma Eleanor was holding up her glass, her eyes bright with a pride I had waited 28 years to see. The right people had found their way to my table. I realized then that love isn't something you manage. It's not something you optimize or bargain for. It's something that shows up when the foundation is honest. I stepped away for a moment, walking toward the edge of the olive grove. The Chicago house was a theater of shadows, but here, everything was real. I tied a small olive green ribbon around the empty chair at the head of the table, the seat that used to belong to the girl who was always flexible. I whispered, "You're free now," and I let the wind carry the words away. The house of cards in Chicago had finally fallen, but I wasn't buried in the rubble. I was in Italy, watching the stars come out over a castle I built myself. Sometimes the quietest revenge is simply choosing to be happy without asking for their permission. Sometimes, the best thing you can do for a family that crops you out of the picture is to buy the camera and start a whole new album. If this story hit home for you, type peace in the comments. Don't forget to like and follow for more stories about finding your own light. Remember, you don't need a seat at their table when you own the whole estate.